rejection of the protection that God offered to Cain, and a statement that Cain needed to see the protection he would have, right? It wouldn't be by faith, but by sight that Cain would walk. He needed to see the protection he would have. He needed to take control into his own hands, not have what God offered. So he founded a city and said, I'm not going to wander, God. I'm sorry. I don't like the whole mark thing. I can't even see it. I'm going to build something with walls. That's what ancient cities were. That's what defined an ancient city, is something that was more or less fortified. So basically, this is the beginning of a soteriological myth about the city. The city as something that saves. The city is an alternate to God's saving. Now, Ellul says the city is, in this portion of his analysis, the city is the source of all cultural accomplishments. This is what I call damning with Ellulian praise. He means it. It's very much praise, right? Without the city, you don't have, he says, education. You don't have economics. You don't have these things he thinks are true. These things he thinks fit into this package, this soteriological myth, as well. So it is praise, but he means it as well to indict the city. He says that it's the city is the greatest accomplishment of human beings, the same way that Jesus Christ is the greatest accomplishment of God. And this says you can choose your salvation one way or the other there. So, but why is this so demeaning? Oh, and then redemption. God, the kingdom of God marches toward us, and it will actually transform the city as we know it. Right? Ellul, I think, would agree that God doesn't say he's making all new things, but he says he's making all things new. And Ellul says that actually the city that we know, that God is transforming in the end. So one wonders what's so demeaning about this. We'll come back to that. Some ethical implications. Ellul says we do need to work in the city. We've heard this before already at this conference. Ellul says we do need to work in the city. He fits a lot of what we face in the city under the rubric of miracle or martyrdom. Miracle or martyrdom. That is, in the city, we don't know what our fate will be. If we work in the city faithfully, God may turn that work into something unexpected and that's contrary to what we would expect in the city, that turns the logic of the city and necessity on its head. And that would be a miracle. Or we can be faithful in our work in the city, and we can come to exactly the kind of fate that we would expect, which is failure. And he says some imprisonment and death. And that would be martyrdom. But you can't know in advance which you'll get. So, a corollary of that is faithfulness versus success. That is, the mindset needs to be one of faithfulness, not a direction towards success. Not an orientation towards success, but an orientation toward faithfulness. So there's a paradox here. If we should work in the city, what's the issue? Where's the demeaning of the city exactly? Well, he seems to claim that no work of politics, policy, planning, or design. I'm sorry, that's double negative. He seems to claim that no work of politics, policy, planning, or design is valuable. Is valuable. That's what comes from working on it at 2 different times. This one is worth reading at least part of. This is a precious nugget from being in the city. How ridiculous, how grotesque is bravado of naked little man. Bravado filling every newspaper, every socialist doctrine, every Protestant journal, every belief in the rebirth of humanism. I am, and there is none else, man shouts. This is in some ways a response to Mumford's one world name. I will stop the whole mess. I will put it in order. It's not so bad as it seems. This urban distress is only the normal course of history. A change of civilizations. And he goes on, basically here and in other places, to say that nothing that we do in the urban environment can be efficacious. At least that's what he seems to say. Yet, Ellul works himself in city administration and activist efforts, etc. And he also brings trenchant critique of certain social institutions, which lead us to believe that some are better than others. Right? So with technological society, he said there's a trenchant critique of technological society, and he says, things here have gotten worse. This ensemble of means and the way that it constrains human freedom. Well, if there's a worse, then there also has to be a better. But at the same time, he seems to reject efforts to make things better. I actually want to resolve this by suggesting there's an apocalyptic Ellul and a prophetic Ellul. And by apocalyptic, I mean the kind of statements, the kinds of arguments that would emphasize the revelation of the kingdom of God and the distance of everything else, the infinite distance of everything else from the kingdom of God. Everything else. That there is an apocalyptic Ellul. The Ellul that says, you can't change this. You can't make it better. Go ahead. Try out your new urban planning. It won't do a thing. Right? But there's also a prophetic Ellul. The one that says there is a difference yet between the different things that we do. Everything is equally and infinitely distant from the kingdom of God, and yet there's a difference between the things that we do. I explain this to my students by saying, okay, so there's an equal and infinite distance seemingly between all fast food and Julian Child, or Rick Bayless's Topo Bongo, right? Doesn't matter what it is. And yet, there's a difference between White Castle and In-N-Out. There's In-N-Out and Chick-fil-A on the one hand, and you got everything else. But all of those are infinitely distant from the very best restaurants and food that we can have, right? The very best food that we can prepare at home. So there's an apocalyptic sort of pronouncement you can make against fast food, and then there's a prophetic version. And I'll take the prophetic version if I'm in Southern California. I've got a choice. So, contribution and continued relevance. We are living in a century of more demographic shift, more social turmoil regarding the city, more scholarly ambivalence. We actually have now, for the first time, more than 50% of the world's population living in cities. That's a huge demographic shift. We have political economic shifts. That is, we have the concentration of organizations that are meant to coordinate geographically dispersed but socially concentrated capital all over the world in cities. This makes them more or less directly articulated to global affairs. These are called global cities. There's a whole sort of scholarly workshop on global cities, and then there's also a whole planning workshop on how to become a global city, how to move up the rankings, etc. I think we need both the apocalyptic and the prophetic impulses that we learn from Ellul in our work on the city now. We need the apocalyptic impulses to deal with global cities and aerotropoli, the idea that the summum bonum is globality, or competition, or efficiency, or innovation. But this is the greatest thing we can all aspire to. We need it with aerotropoli. You can read my review of Aerotropolis in Books and Culture. I snuck in a little reference. That was fun. But on the other hand, we need the prophetic impulse to deal with new urban formations like mega slums. Slums of over 1 million people. Slums bigger than most cities in most of human history. We need the prophetic impulse there. And the last slide, I won't go into that. What is the city for? This is a discussion that we ought to have now on the heels of understanding Ellul on the city better, understanding this apocalyptic and prophetic impulse, or these two impulses. Then we have this question of what is the city for? Let's talk about that. But we don't have time. My time's been up for about a minute.